Welcome to Business Talk here on businesstech.co.za, South Africa's #1 news website. And it's book season, as we know, towards the end of the year. And one book that is about to hit the shelves promises to get tongues wagging more than most, I suspect. It's entitled The Spell and written by prolific author and CEO of Monocle Solutions, David Buckham, and co-author Robin Wilkinson. It really is. It's a big, ambitious book. And it was a great pleasure reading the early manuscripts for David. And it's not content on being one thing. It's kind of part history, part philosophy, part cultural commentary, and it's stitched together with a very clear sense of urgency about where the West finds itself today. And I think at its core, the book argues that the West has lost its soul. We've been seduced by power, by technocratic fetishism, by spectacle, and Buckham reaches deep into the past to show us how we got here, by drawing on Hesiod's Ages of Man, on Socrates, and Kant, on Nietzsche and Foucault, and then weaving that into famine and scarcity narratives, into Cold War politics, and even comic books. And this is where I think Buckham is at his best, because one moment you're reading about Jamal Khashoggi's murder with all of the tension of investigative journalism, and the next you're pulled into a meditation on Superman or Apocalypse Now as allegories of moral collapse. It's sweeping, it's provocative, and at times exhilarating. David, welcome. And your last book, Orthogonal Thinking, was recently longlisted for the Sunday Times Literary Awards. So I think expectations have risen somewhat. Now with The Spell, which is subtitled The Story of Human Progress and How the West Lost Its Soul, I think you've gone even bigger because of weaving all of those things that I said in my introduction together with pop culture and this grand narrative. Let's just start there. What compelled you to write this book, and why now?
Michael, thank you so much for that intro, and I hope the book lives up to expectations. I'm really excited about it. We started writing this book 3 years ago, and it was orthogonal thinking, and prior to that, why banks fail were kind of many exercises whilst this book was underground. And this book has over 300,000 words that have been condensed into 110,000 words. Not to put the reader off, but we've excluded entire sections just to keep the book within the realms of readability. And what really is the reason that we wrote the book was this kind of question where there's two questions. There's kind of a WTF moment. It's like the sheer math sort of moral blindness that is everywhere that you look, coupled with the greed that you see, and the moral blindness of people in general, and of nations and of the West itself. And how did we get here? I'll give you one example, just one example. Saudi Arabia, totalitarian regime, mass execution just a few years ago, 83 dissidents, or MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, according to the CIA, I'm not making this up, ordered the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post journalist, at the Turkish embassy, at the Saudi embassy in Turkey. As a public investment fund of $1.1 trillion, but has pledged to build a net zero or net negative city by 2030 called NEOM at a cost of $500 billion. It's already overrunning costs. So people are not kind of worrying too much about this. They're going to spend half of the public investment fund money on building NEOM, which is definitely not a viable, architectural city. I mean, by any stretch of the imagination. But people like the glitz and the glamour. There's a comedy festival right now taking place. In Saudi Arabia. You can't even make that up. I mean, as Mark Maron put it, the people who brought you 9/11, that's not, again, not my joke. That's a joke from, and another really good example, Michael, is that one of the critical ingredients to TMSC, which makes semiconductors for NVIDIA, is a rare earth element called dysprosium, which is one of the 17 rare earth elements. And 99.9% of it is produced in one mine in China. It used to be produced in America, in California, in a place called Mountain Pass in California. But because of environmental laws, they closed it down. So it's such a good example of what I'm talking about in The Spell, which is that the kind of narrative, the apocalyptic narrative, which is the narrative that we're all going to die because the earth is overheating, and this hysteria around climate change and pollution inadvertently leads to America exceptionalism being they're exceptionally dependent on Chinese products. China saw this coming a long time ago. So these are two examples I've given of incredible moral blindness, cognitive dissonance on a mass scale that's not publicly debated, that's not discussed, we just carry on with one next revolution after another. Can I give you another example?
I just want to pick up on the climate change narrative, because that's one area when I read the book, I agreed with almost 90% of it, but maybe took a slightly different perspective on the IPCC, because you suggest the IPCC's language was slipped into alarmism, and you talk about this apocalyptic narrative and the politics of it. But aren't you worried that critique risks feeding skepticism rather than sharpening urgency? Because I read this section and I thought, yes, alarmism is obviously dangerous, but so can be minimizing urgency equally dangerous.
Yes, I've had many debates with climatologists and scientists about this, where I say to them, are you happy with the way that it's become unscientific? Because you're using models that are plotting, outcomes for temperature in, quadrants and sectors of the air, air temperature, air speed, CO2 emissions in 2072. And that's translated into policy, which has become apocalyptic. And most famously, when John Kerry said that the Ukrainian war would distract the world from, the more urgent apocalypse, which is climate change. I think the argument against the urgency narrative is that you end up making policy decisions that are wrong. So, for example, you promote EVs, but you don't think about the long-term consequences of how you're going to be. First of all, EVs are very dependent on the Chinese Communist Party allowing you to buy their minerals and their batteries and their solar panels. But second of all, how do you get rid of them? What is the long-run impact? You can't get rid of a lithium-ion battery. It's very, very difficult. So what happens is if you're too urgent, you have bad policy in a multipolar world that ends up with inadvertent, unintended consequences, such as what we're seeing, which is anyway, the US has exited the Paris Accord because Trump has come into power, because we're so addicted to sort of, Trumpism. Half of America voted for Trump. That should tell you a lot about how much people care about the planet.
It tells you a lot about a lot of things, around mega politics and what Trump has done very famously in pandering to, his base, which feels like globalization. And when you talk about China, particularly the rise of China has come at the expense of the American blue collar worker. I agree with you that I think we've failed to connect globally the unintended consequences of our policy choices and decisions from a geopolitical level, because the West has, to an extent, handed China this huge leverage when it comes to EVs. They've got an arm lock on the manufacture of solar panels, for example. And I would argue, again, that we probably need to see more development of nuclear energy, but the green lobby or the environmental lobby has certainly pushed back against that. On the models and the science, though, I would argue that it's fairly unequivocal. I'd say where the disconnect has happened is how we then implement that in a way that doesn't create these unintended geopolitical consequences. Because again, when you see the IPCC meet at the various COP summits, China gets to play both sides of the room. China pitches itself as a developing country. Meanwhile, it's the world's second largest economy. It's continuing to churn out carbon emissions. And as much as it's leading the world in renewable energy, it continues to build out new coal-fired power stations. So again, it comes back to your cognitive dissonance that we see all over the world at the moment. And that's really where I found the book to be quite an important mirror in terms of the moment that we're currently in. I want to come back, though, to, and I think one of the most powerful kind of through lines in the spell is this idea of scarcity, and in particular the Irish famine, because you look at it and you don't just treat it as an historical kind of tragedy, but it's something of a turning point, because you tie together Thomas Malthus's population theories, and he's a very well-known scarcity economist, with Charles Trevelyan's bureaucratic indifference. And I think, the moral rationalizations that allowed suffering on that scale. So maybe you could just start with that connection. Why did you choose the famine as such a central motif in the book? Because it really is quite powerful.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's kind of one of those things that go back to my entire philosophy as it pertains to philanthropy, which is, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or Bob Geldof running Live Aid. And what could be better than, buying a ticket or donating? You didn't have to buy it. The concert was free. Live Aid concert was free. And Bob Geldof shamed all these musicians into getting into one room to make a song called We Are the World, or, Do They Know It's Christmas? And, that makes you feel good, right? So you donate this money and everything is okay then in the world, because now we've given to Africa. But what's actually happening is Bob Geldof is too lazy to do anything but give it to the Mengistu regime, which makes the famine worse. So what happens with Thomas Malthus is he provides, so for listeners who don't know Thomas Malthus, he basically says that the world's going to be overpopulated, we're going to run out of food, and there's going to be an apocalyptic end to the world because the poor are having too many children. And he was saying that, in the early 1800s, and it probably sounds familiar to people now, we still live with this kind of innate racist, inherently racist ideology that there are too many people in the world, particularly in Africa and particularly in China. And these basic assumptions are wrong. The world found a way to make more food. But in those days, in the Irish famine, 4.5 million people was the population in Ireland in 1900. In 1860, the population was 9 million, 8.5 million. I mean, it was one of the greatest tragedies of all time. And it's something that reoccurs in Africa right now. It's happening in Sudan. In the 1980s, it happened in Ethiopia. And we've seen what's happening in Gaza with food becoming weaponized. So the point of famine is that inherently, I believe that people have an assumption that the world is overpopulated, we're destroying the planet, and the basic human worth is denied. Is one of the messages of the book is that we somehow think inherently that we're destroying our planet and our environment, and we are inherently bad, that human beings are inherently bad. And that narrative, whilst it might sound obvious, like we're obviously destroying our planet, has allowed for policies that allow for greenwashing, for sports washing, for the rise of totalitarian regimes, for the destruction of democracies. And I know it sounds crazy that I'm linking the green narrative to the destruction of democracy, but I can prove it almost. It's a very arrogant statement. Can I be less arrogant? I would like to suggest, please read the book, and then we can at least discuss whether Robin and I have managed to somewhat prove that the apocalyptic narrative, that the Malthusian narrative, has led inadvertently to a very unequal world, one in which we continue to pursue policies such as the World Bank and the IMF and the COP policies, which are inherently unfair. And you see it in Europe when they implement CBAM. For those who don't know, CBAM is a tax that they're going to tax at the border. When we export aluminium to Europe, they are now charging us a tax because we created the aluminium using coal-fired stations, so they want to punish us. But, I mean, Africa's got barely any growth.
Yeah.
So now we've been punished because of all their sins.
And also, if you look at South Africa, for example, less than 1% of global CO2 emissions. And I know some might then retort and say yes, but emissions per capita, and if you look at single point source emissions like Secunda, Sasol's, plant is one of the highest in the world. But again, I think this gets lost, that nuance in the debate. For you, because I think at times that moral voice is so forceful, it does border on something or could be viewed as deterministic. So how do you guard against overstating the case? Because the passion is obviously there chatting to you and it's there on every page reading it. But sometimes that can obscure nuance. And I think you've done that well, though. How did you and Robin approach that?
Michael, we had such an interesting... The book was toned down quite substantially, not put readers off. So the version you read was pre the toning down, and I think you then read the subsequent versions. But it's hard to forget the tone. And my amazing editor, Tim Richmond, really toned me down with the promise that in interviews such as this, I could then, be much more direct. So the book is let me present. The book presents the information in a certain order so that the reader can come to their own conclusion. The conclusion is really a series of questions. Is what is the purpose of humanity, of human progress? Have we progressed really in the last 50 years? If you look at that question and you ask, most people will say, of course, we've progressed in the last 50 years. But in South Africa, our mortality age has declined in the last 3 years. We're actually going backwards. Africa, we are across many metrics. People will talk about, global poverty as, being reduced dramatically. That's not because of the World Bank or the IMF. That's because of the China one-child policy. That's because of central planning in China, a totalitarian state. Most of poverty reduction by absolute numbers and relative numbers has occurred not because of democracy, not because of healthy debate. So many of the assumptions that we make in our cozy democracies are not necessarily true. including but not limited to climate change, vaccinations, COVID, medicine, our understanding of science. So I'm trying to ask, Robin and I are trying to ask some difficult questions in a kind of fun way. I know it's going to sound not so much like a fun way, but that's why we put the comic book superheroes in, and why we had the zombies in there. So I don't know if people realize this was just my son was watching. Do you remember that Brad Pitt movie set in Israel about the Z War, the War of the Z War, 2013? Do you remember, with the Jerusalem and the zombies coming over the wall? And what a profound prediction of the future, that movie, World War Z. If you watch that movie and you've just got off BBC and had the Gaza documentary, it's like distressingly similar. What I'm saying is that there's also something much deeper than the assumptions that we make in the stories that we tell. Something much deeper than us, which is like this 1,000-year-old history that we carry with us. This fear of plague. There was an increase in zombie movies leading up to COVID-19, not from 10 movies to 20 movies, but from 10 movies to 500 movies. There's an incredible alignment of cultural iconography. So I believe that we carry within us, even me and even you, and even in this discussion, an inherent set of assumptions and predilections, and that are so deeply held notions within us that it's virtually impossible for us to get away from them. And that you almost have to really read widely, and you really need to think outside of one's frame of reference to sit back and recognize, wow, we are under a spell.
Yeah. And I think
we're all under this national
in
spell.
the section, I think it's towards the end of the book, where you write about the Jungian idea of this collective unconscious that we all share, and something that's very difficult to explain, but then manifests, to your point, around the spike in cultural references to zombie movies just before we have COVID, which is effectively, that collective unconscious fear surfacing, coming to life. I found that, the hair in the back of my neck kind of stood up when you connect those things. But, to my earlier point, maybe, and I don't want people to misunderstand me. When I say certain sections could have been deterministic, I don't think they were, because what you did, and certainly from the first manuscripts to the later versions, was hone that down. But importantly, you focused on showing, not telling. So, and I think, the interesting thing for me is that when you read the book, and someone who's reading the book for the first time might look at the broad sweep of it, and some might say maybe this is 5 or 6 different books stitched together, because you've got the famine, philosophy, Vietnam, comic books, but you hold all of them together. Ultimately, at the end, when you start as the reader yourself, you start asking questions of yourself and those assumptions that you've held. Was that a challenge for you? Because I find, as an intellectual exercise, to weave all of that together into something that actually ultimately anchors at the end was borderline genius. I mean, for how long have you had this idea of weaving all of those different narratives together to hold up that mirror?
Michael, thank you. I'm very flattered. It's been an idea that I've had for a long, long time, many, many years, where we had like an A0 paper on the wall. And I said, okay, let's say we were going to tell stories. And so each story would be a line. So I'm going to tell the story of the Irish famine. Then I want to tell the story of Bob Geldof. And then I want to, in order to tell the story of the West losing its soul, we'd have to give the history of the soul. The history of the soul would be the history of Western philosophy. You're going to need to tell people about the 5 ages of man and then the development of the idea of the soul. Then where does the West really lose the soul? Well, in my opinion, and this was a big argument that I had with Tim, I can anchor it at a particular point in time. It's Vietnam. It's where America goes from the world's superhero kind of, to being malignant and evil. And it was the famous shot of the Viet Cong girl, with the clothes on, or that man getting shot in the street by the South Vietnamese army. That famous shot of his brain being blown out, and that's where you get Nixon, and after Nixon you get the seeds of the global financial crisis, because you get America moving away from the gold standard. So all of this is a lot of information. So what we did is we plotted it out on an A0 paper into about 12 or 15 different narratives, some of which never made it to the book. Like we had 8,000 words on the history of Saudi Arabia. We had 8,000 words on the history of Sudan. So I'd love to one day write like the Big Daddy version of the spell, but it would be volumes. And then we decided, how is a person going to pick up a book and read 30,000 words on Western philosophy? It's like, how do you hold someone's attention for that long? So then what we needed to do was, we had this kind of jump diffusion method. So I'm going to go from there to there. Then the question became, how many stories can a person hold in their head in one go? And the perfect way to answer that question is to watch a series called Breaking Bad. In Breaking Bad, they'll have 3 or 4 different narratives which are all completely unrelated, but which start to come together. But if it was 5 or 6, it's too many. So as soon as we finish with the Irish famine, we can then introduce another one, because we're always going to ask the reader to have 3 or 4 at a time, 4 or 5 at a stretch. So you'll see there's certain parts of the book where there's 4 or 5, but then one will end and we can introduce another. And it was so much fun, Michael, to put it together, because we had these 250,000 words, 300,000 words, and I went away for like a month, and I just started playing with the chapters, and then I would read fast, and then I'd go, no, this doesn't work. We got to cut Sudan out. We've had Ethiopia, it's enough. So it was a lot of fun. And then somewhere along the way, I just suddenly realized we could split the book into 5 parts, which would be the 5 ages of man. And then each would reflect the kind of descent of man away from, meaning, away from the Promethean sin, and you get this resonance. I mean, the Christian Bible will say that, Eve and Adam ate of the apple, which was offered to them by the serpent. But it's not that different to man, getting fire from Prometheus and then being punished for it by Zeus. In all of these religions and in all of these narratives, man, meaning men, women, and children, the human being, is punished because somehow they've received something that's not innocent. I think it's quite fascinating.
Really is the stories. And that's why I found it such a rollicking read. I think you'll recall when you gave me the first manuscript, I got hold of you on the Monday morning. I think I got it on the Friday, and I've just devoured it over the weekend. Because, well, you got me on a good weekend where my partner was away, so I had nothing but a bit of rugby and my Labrador to keep me company. So it was one of those, but the perfect book to dive into for the weekend. But back to how you've woven this all together, because I think your narrative voice is very confident and almost cinematic at times, and the writing is really of the highest order. And, if you look at that Khashoggi preface or the way you pull in Dr. Strangelove, and it really reminded me more of a narrative nonfiction than a conventional kind of political analysis or anything like that. But I think, again, the way you use those cultural touchstones, Superman, Apocalypse Now, even the X-Men, does make that philosophy and that narrative arc feel much more alive and not just abstract. It must have been really difficult to research, though, because there are a lot of facts in the book as well. So how long did that take?
Yeah. Yeah, I must tell you, Michael, if there's something that I didn't know before I started writing the spell, and something that we didn't know, that including Robin and myself and our researcher Janae, we were at a party, a Monocle party. There were like 400 people, and Janae. And so what happened was we'd write the chapters, and they were written over 3 years. I mean, you can imagine 300,000 words, so it's a lot, right? And not everyone kept their references. I mean, we didn't realize that we were going to use this part or that part. So ex post, we were trying to find references for facts. And we're in a very dangerous time at the moment where you think that you know something because you found it on ChatGPT, but actually it's wrong. And what happened, Tim was taking each chapter, feeding, and by the way, there's 68 chapters, and with the preface, but I don't want anyone to be put off by that. No chapter is longer than 2,000 words. Most chapters are 1,500 words. They're like articles in a newspaper. So what Tim was doing was feeding the chapters into ChatGPT and asking ChatGPT to find factual errors. And then ChatGPT would come back and I would get a call from Tim saying there's 12 factual errors in one chapter. And then we would spend 36 hours stressing to discover that 10 of the factual errors were not factual errors. The 2 were. And then we would have this massive anxiety attack. And then we realized that for every single sentence in the book, we took every single sentence in the book, we broke it down into fact 0001, fact 0002. There were 3,600 or 3,700 facts. And I have to tell you that I have lost faith in our ability to create sources of record, meaningful sources of record. And watching Trump destroy universities overseas and to destroy systems of record and university archives, and to think of the fire in the UCT library and think of the fire of Alexandria. We live in times where it's not self-evident to me that we will have a single record that we agree upon of a series of facts. Can I give a very horrifying example? Douglas Murray wrote a book called On Democracies and Death Cults, which is about the Middle East. On page 3, he states that there were so many people living in Palestine at the time, and his source is not authentic. And he's a well-known writer. Just by seeing his name, you would trust him. So it's extremely disturbing. I've got nothing personally against Douglas Murray, but I find it extremely disturbing how unfactual we are, how we don't have a system of record. And I'm very proud to say that we authenticated with an original source every fact in the book. And we have thousands and thousands and thousands of words of reference. We're actually going to publish a separate book for free, which will just be the references, which we're busy working on.
Well, it's refreshing. Right now. I mean, in a post-truth world, as you say, where facts don't really seem to matter anymore, and it's just about how strongly you can hold an opinion and shout it into the public square in social media. We have to remain, anchored to at least the objective pursuit of the truth, as contested as that may be. And so it's really encouraging to hear that you went through that level of detail. But just, David, as you know, we are running out of time, sadly. And I mean, do you see where we are, this moment in time, the kind of decline of Western civilization? Do you see it as cyclical, following Hesiod's model, or are we entering genuinely uncharted territory? Because some would argue that because of technology and AI and climate change and globalization, all of this makes this moment qualitatively different to what we've seen in the past. And if the story is one of progress slash decline, depending on which way you look at it, I mean, is there hope? What would it take, and what would you like the reader to take from it in terms of a hopeful message? And do you see hope emerging anywhere in particular, in movements, in philosophy, and individuals around the world?
Absolutely, Michael. I mean, that the reader should get to the end of the spell elated with hope, because we present Viktor Frankl standing naked in a concentration camp, having no knowledge of the whereabouts or whether his wife or his parents were alive, which very unfortunately they weren't. And understanding that he would derive some kind of meaning from meaning itself, meaning of love, meaning of life. He created, logos is the word for meaning in ancient Greek. So he gets out of the concentration camp in Auschwitz and comes up with a new form of therapy called logotherapy. And after the Second World War, which was horrific, you get an enormous surge of possibility with nuclear, the invention of nuclear power, the hope of nuclear fusion, which would be kind of frictionless energy. And that is somewhat then destroyed by Nixon and Kissinger, and then by the greed of the 1980s. And then you get hope again in the 1990s, where you get the failure of the USSR, and you get this idea of globalization and China, and everyone could go to China, and you could go to Eastern Europe, and you had the end of Slobodan Milosevic. Yeah, I mean the Serbians lost. Yugoslavia had peace. So it is cyclical, Michael. I'm not saying that I can see the end of the conflict. It's not obvious to me how this all ends. And I do think there's a great deal of danger in this kind of pseudo-scientific narrative of AI, blockchain, Bitcoin. It's just like this, the inequality is at its greatest level since the 19th century. But definitely it's cyclical. Definitely there is hope. Viktor Frankl emerged over the ashes of World War II.
No, and one is left with that, but I was also left, just having read orthogonal thinking quite recently, over a year ago, was that was for me about searching for meaning, whereas the spell feels a bit like it's almost confronting the loss of meaning. But how did we get here, and where could we go? Not necessarily where will we, but where could we? Again, back to that show don't tell kind of technique that you weave into the book. So something of a continuation of your intellectual journey. Has the book changed you at all as a thinker or personally in writing this, as a final question?
Yes, it has. I learned so much writing this book. I had no idea. I had an instinct, for example, that we have tendency for overconfidence as human beings in our own capability. But I had no idea until researched the book, how overconfident we are. I mean, we had 12 people land on the moon. 12 people walked on the moon in the 1970s. But we've made relatively little progress since then. The world has become more unequal since the 1970s. There's been poverty alleviation, but it hasn't been great. Scientific discovery has not been fantastic. We have more accurate telescopes, and the more accurate the telescopes get, the worse our understanding of the universe gets, because we get contradictory answers from the telescope. There's a chapter in the book about this, which is that the grand unified theory is becoming less and less clear to us, and Einsteinian physics less and less clear. So I didn't know that I had an instinct that we were overconfident, but I didn't know just how enraptured we are by our own overconfidence. I was quite shocked, even as the author.
Well, David, thank you for your time, for your honesty, and for putting pen to paper on such an ambitious and provocative book. Because I think whether as a reader you agree with every point or not, what the spell does is it forces you to engage. And I think, to me, that is the mark of serious writing. You want to interrogate, and you want to interrogate those beliefs, and that maybe confront that overconfidence and that hubris. So I'm really looking forward to the launch. Looking forward to getting a physical copy in my hand. And just thank you and Robin so much for producing what is going to be an absolute humdinger. I'm sure it's going to fly into the top 10 in no time at all good bookstores. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mike.